Tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai. Hello and welcome to this session as part of the Climate Governance Initiative Virtual Summit. My name is Guy Beatson and I head the Governance Leadership Centre at the Institute of Directors in New Zealand. The IOD is very proud to be hosting Chapter Zero New Zealand, our national arm of the Climate Governance Initiative. Our session today, over the next hour, is designed for a global director audience to take you through the process to date towards the development of the framework and standards for mandatory climate-related disclosures here in New Zealand. We hope this session will be useful for all directors around the world who will be at some stage subject to their own climate reporting requirements. Following the discussion with our two speakers today, we'll have around 20 minutes for questions from the live audience. If you would like to pose a question, please add it in the Q&A area of the webinar, and we'll work through those as we get to them. In September 2020, the New Zealand government announced its intention to implement mandatory reporting on climate risks and tasked the External Reporting Board, XRB, with developing reporting standards to support the new reporting regime. In October 2020, the Financial Sector Climate-Related Disclosures and Other Matters Amendment Bill was agreed by New Zealand's Parliament. As a result, the XRB now has a mandate to issue climate standards as part of a climate-related disclosures framework and guidance on non-financial matters. Once the XRB issues its first climate standard, climate-related disclosures will become mandatory for around 200 large listed companies with a market capitalisation of more than $60 million, large licensed insurers, registered banks, credit unions, building societies, and managers of investment schemes with more than $1 billion in assets, and also some government-owned financial institutions through expectations set by government ministers. The XRB aims to issue its first climate standard in December this year, meaning these entities would be required to make disclosures alongside wider year-end reporting in 2023 at the earliest. We're very fortunate today to have with us the chair of the XRB, Michelle Emling, who has steered these new climate-related disclosure reporting requirements. In addition to her role with the XRB, Michelle's current appointments include the Centre for Sustainable Finance, Transpower, Power Finance Limited, and the Australian Financial Reporting Council. To provide some further insights and an example of how corporate boards are preparing for the disclosure requirements, we're also pleased to have with us today Fiona McKenzie, who is a non-executive director of the board of Sanford, New Zealand's oldest and largest seafood company, and also the chair of Sanford's Audit, Finance and Risk Subcommittee. Fiona is also a director of ANZ New Zealand Investments Limited, and is the Managing Director Funds Management for ANZ Bank New Zealand. Sanford have been very forward-focused, providing integrated reporting over the last 4 or 5 years, drawing on the TCFD framework, and is now working towards the New Zealand climate standards. Sanford reports have been held up as an exemplar of good practice on sustainability and integrated reporting. But Fiona will share with us some practical insights and experience from the Sanford board, as we all collectively prepare for climate-related disclosures on the horizon. So we can first turn to Michelle, and let's talk about climate-related disclosures in New Zealand and the latest developments. Welcome, Michelle.
Kia ora, Guy. Thank you, and welcome to everybody online today.
So let's start at the beginning. Can you provide us an overview of New Zealand's approach to climate-related disclosures, including a bit of a summary of what's been done to date?
Sure. So maybe I'll start with why the External Reporting Board. So we are the national standard setters. So we're an independent Crown entity, which means we're funded by the government, but they can't tell us what to put in our individual standards. And we've been in existence for 10 years. We would be seen as a traditional standard setter in that we put out the standards for financial reporting for for-profit entities and for public sector and charities. And then we also issue standards for auditing and assurance as well. And like most of everyone online today, we all realise that traditional financial statements are lacking and don't tell the full story. So we could see and have been expecting a change in reporting that will be needed for a number of years, and have been doing work in the background. It's fair to say, though, when it came to climate and the government looking for somebody to take up this challenge, we didn't necessarily think ideally that we were the obvious people to do it. Yes, we were very good at standard setters. We felt that we had mature processes and good oversight, etc. But we had like every board, I suspect, and every management team, we had a lack of capacity and also capability in understanding matters related to climate. So. But we thought about it long and hard, and one of our main vision as the XRB is that our country prospers through effective decision making that is informed by useful information that is integrated. So it actually felt within that it aligned nicely with our vision. We had a really short time frame. So as you mentioned, we went from an idea of the government in 2020. We didn't actually get a change in our mandate until later in 21, but we will issue a standard by the end of this year, so December this year. And we could have rushed off and just picked up the TCFD, which was government had indicated that was the starting point, because that was at that point it was seen as being the most had the most credibility globally. We could have just picked it up and plonked it in, but we didn't feel that that was going to achieve the objective. And the objective really is to enable New Zealand to move to a low emissions economy as efficiently and effectively and as quickly as we can. So we could have had a disclosure regime, but that wouldn't have brought about the behavioural change that was needed. So we thought we needed to approach this standard setting very differently than any other standard that we'd ever set before. And we wanted to bring companies, directors, regulators, and users along the road with us. So we started an iterative process of consultation and transparency right the way through, so that people could see what we were doing. We asked for comments, we had advisory groups. The standard itself has 4 specific areas, and those online today will be familiar with these areas because they are the same as in the TCFD itself. So there's governance and risk management, and strategy and metrics and targets. We're following that process, and we issued a first draft of governance and risk management in October 21. We followed that up with strategy and metrics in March 22, and now we issued in July this year exposure drafts for everything combined, so people could see where we'd got to. We've had over 200 formal submissions. We have had 3,000 people participating in events. We've done lots of deep dives, and then we've worked closely with umbrella groups like the Institute of Directors in New Zealand and Chapter Zero, and we really do value all of the support that we've received from you, Guy, and your team on this with us. We've been really encouraged by the level of engagement that we've got, and fingers crossed, I think we've managed to anticipate most of the issues. Still working through all those submissions, and we're going to have to make some calls, right? And you're not going to please all the people all the time. There'll be some people who think we've gone too fast, too hard, and there'll be others who think that we haven't gone, fast enough. But we have said that this is not the end. The standard will be issued in December. We will continue to issue guidance, and I know we'll get onto some points later on, Guy, around international movements. So that's probably a long answer to your question, but hopefully it's of some use for the context for everybody online.
And I think what you've outlined sets the scene for all of this, and particularly the focus that starts with that governance layer. When that's largely where our focus has been, and I think we're quite a lot of the focus for our audience. But with such an extensive process and such a new area for many people, what have been some of the biggest challenges the XRB has faced through the process you've outlined?
Look, I suspect some of these challenges are highly aligned to challenges that we all face as directors, and indeed as I'm facing as a director on some of my boards. So the first one is capability and capacity, and building that within, if it's not within the organisation or within the board, how are you actually going to get that in? And so we needed to look and bring in some different looking people, and people with different qualifications, not accountants. And that's been really, really interesting. So people focused on policy, people who understand the science and so forth. The other thing I'd say is New Zealand, our companies, even our largest companies, are relatively small by global standards. So coming up with a standard that is globally aligned, but is actually relevant in a New Zealand context with the size of our organisations, I think trying to get that balance right is an ongoing challenge. Recognising that there is no one global standard at the moment, this is very different to IFRS. So when most of the countries around the world moved to international financial reporting standards, there was already a body of standards that was pretty well developed and mature. Yes, there were some bits that had to be added, but we all within our own countries, and we all had our own local accounting standards or financial reporting standards. And countries like New Zealand and Australia and Canada and many others had already done work of comparing their standards to the international ones anyway. So it wasn't yes, it was a big challenge, but the global scene on sustainability standards, it's still quite formative, and there are still a lot of players. So there's no agreed, this is the standard that we will all follow. And then engagement has not been a challenge, so that's been good. And I think, the timing was right for us, so we were fortunate with that. We haven't had to spend a lot of time explaining why this is important. All the organisations that we've been dealing with get it. They understand why this is important. So it's been more about the how and how to get going and etc. And then finally, I would say, the things that will be a continual challenge will be material. What is material? Which is about choices of what gets disclosed and what doesn't, and what is value and what is valued when you come to enterprise value. And as you mentioned, we've got a number of organisations that will have to apply these standards who are not for-profits. They operate in the public sector. So they have a different lens on value and stakeholders. So there is more work to be done in those areas.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mean, you're painting a picture of evolution. And one, there's a balance in here from what you've said in terms of the consistency and the consistency with that standard, both here in New Zealand, but also internationally on one side, but also then reflecting as things move both in New Zealand and internationally, having the ability to update that. And I guess there's an interesting question in here. So these disclosures are going to be new for stakeholders, for business, for investors, for suppliers, customers, and employees. What's the expectation of the XRB and possibly your wider role as a director in terms of the impact that these climate-related disclosures, as they get implemented from 2023, what impact will they have on those stakeholders?
Well, I think the expectations are already there. So by and large, most companies will be experiencing the range of stakeholders. There are more of them, and their expectations are higher. So the expectation is kind of already there. What the disclosures will do, it will allow organisations to demonstrate their strategic foresight and how organised they are really. Because it really is providing transparency on spotlight of organisations might have been saying, yes, we're taking climate into account and we've thought about it, et cetera, and we are going to be net zero by X and we're going to reduce our emissions here, et cetera. But this will bring it into a concise and consistent standard and a way of disclosing, and people will be able to compare and ask questions. So I think the spotlight will become on those who both good and bad in terms of what people have been able to achieve and what they haven't. So I think it will provide that transparency. And for the laggards who haven't yet started, I'm hoping that it will spark the behavioural change that will be needed, that their shareholders will be expecting, that they get on and start thinking about this and working and planning towards it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we in our submission on the climate-related disclosures exposure draft, we made a point that we think, in addition to the stuff you've talked about, the disclosures may well put a spotlight on, at least for the larger entities, their governance processes as they relate to strategy and risk and so on and so forth. Is that something you've considered?
Yeah, definitely. And I think when you look in the section that deals with governance, it could be written over any subject really. because it's and I'm sure that all directors online today, if you read the governance section, you'd think, well, actually, this is just really us doing our job. And it could be on any matter that is significant for our organisations, because it's all about the strategy and the future. And one of the ways that on the boards that I'm on, that I've started to think about, well, what questions do I need to ask, is actually just by reading the governance section. I go, can I answer that off the top of my head? Do I feel confident that if I was asked that question, that I could say, yes, this is how I as a director am comfortable that we have thought about the impact, not only the risks, but the opportunities of climate matters on our business and our strategy. And this is how I know that we are making progress. So a lot of what I would call the governance section and the risk management section, to my mind, once you've worked through it and you understand a little bit about the climate, which we all are, and getting up to speed in, they just make good sense. I don't think they are confusing or that difficult. It'll be difficult if you haven't done any work.
Right, and we made that point in our submission too, in terms of the cost element of this. If you're already kind of in this space and you're starting to think about it, both as an organisation but also as a board, then the shift, and we'll talk to Fiona a little bit about that as well, is relatively straightforward. The other thing that we've got observed, and I think we'll kind of get you to think, or to tell us a little bit more about your experience as a non-executive director, but that whole notion of integrating the climate change perspective, both in an adaptation sense and an emissions reduction sense, with that strategy, with risk management, with those opportunities. If you were kind of giving advice on the other side of that, wearing your other hat, about complying with this mandatory reporting, what would you say to your fellow non-executive directors?
So while the standard is not designed to be a how-to, it's, for a director, it sort of is in a way when I've reflected on it. So I sort of thought, because I've had to deal with this on a number of boards as well, and so maybe I will just share my sort of thought process and how I go about dealing with that. So I think the first thing is, who are your stakeholders and what's actually important to them? Now, that should be on a range of issues, but the whole idea with the reporting is to answer a question that people will have, whether that's an investor. So what are the questions are you being asked at an AGM or other organisations in your sector and industry? What are your bankers asking you? What are your employees? So I'd start there. Second thing is actually capability and capacity within the management team and the board, and how do you supplement that? And for different companies, different needs will be required. Fiona will talk about Sanford in a minute, and I'm on Transpower board, which owns the net grid operator in New Zealand. So it's pretty vital that we have a significant level of understanding, but for others it will be of lesser importance. Then where is your level of maturity within the organisation? Because you, as a director, need to influence and move them. With one of mine that would see itself as very mature in terms of also all doing TCFD, for me it was about shifting that mindset from TCFD as a voluntary, we're moving to mandatory. Directors are personally liable, and so is the company. So let's change that. And then where's our gap analysis? So what do we currently do, but where are our gaps and what do we need to do differently? But then also recognising for those who are less mature, you have to start, and maybe it's baby steps. And where do you start? And it's the conversation that's in the boardroom, and the disclosures will fall out the other way. The other thing I'd say is be aware that the processes and controls, even for the most mature reporters, right, are not going to be, or I would be highly surprised if they are at the level of maturity that your processes and controls would be around your normal financial reporting and compliance reporting that you've been doing for eons. And you're reporting things that are forward-looking. So think about, I'm thinking about, okay, so what is our quality process? What gives me confidence as a director that our statements that we are making, including forward-looking, that actually we've done requisite work, that we've got confidence in those. And we're not going to be accused of greenwashing or green wishing, or we're not leaving a train wreck for the directors who follow us, who have to report against some aspirational target in 10 years that we have no show of getting, because that will undermine value. And so those are the sorts of things, Guy, that I think.
That's really good. And it's a really nice bridge to the discussion we're about to have with Fiona. But I also think in terms of some of the stuff you've just talked about, it probably gives some D&O insurers a few conniptions as well. And a few sleepless nights. Before we get to Fiona, can I just remind people, we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. You can submit those questions and answers through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. It'd be really nice to have a few questions for both Fiona and Michelle as we get towards the end of the session. So if we can turn to Fiona, we're going to get a director's and board perspective on this new disclosure regime, but also some of Sanford's experience prior to this. I guess we should start in talking about Sanford, because Sanford's been at this for a little bit, not necessarily the climate-related disclosures piece, but certainly sustainability reporting, given its goals and aspirations. So talk a little bit about how Sanford and possibly more broadly, how you see where the climate-related disclosures have actually come from and what impetus has driven that.
Thanks, guys. So Sanford is interesting because we disclosed our first greenhouse gas footprint way back in 2001. So you're exactly right. We have actually been at this for quite a long time. We moved into assurance over that footprint since about 2014. We've had significant emission reduction initiatives in our actual business from about 2018 onwards. So, for example, we took 1,700 tonnes of carbon dioxide out every year when we switched from a coal boiler in our Timaru processing to biomass. So there's all these sorts of things that have been part of our DNA for a very long time. And the reason it's been part of our DNA from sort of a long time ago, our strategy is very much focused on sustainable seafood. You just can't be true to sustainable seafood unless sustainability is really hard coded into everything you do. So I think, to some of the challenges that Michelle highlighted around capability, absolutely Sanford's in a good spot. We have a really superb head of sustainability in Peter Longdale, who does a great job, and he works closely across the whole of Sanford to make sure that we are, really saying doing what we say we do. Having said that, it's still, and so I think we would say that's positioned us well, both in terms of capability and sort of it's positioned us in terms of baby steps towards the brave new world of mandatory climate-related disclosure. I still think it's a bit of a voyage of discovery, and there's probably some good lessons from how Sanford has approached it. I think at different ages and stages of Sanford, our aspirations have potentially been a little bit ahead of where the business is, and we've sort of had to grapple with how do we make sure our aspirations are putting sufficient tension on the company to move forward into an increasingly more sustainable world, but not get so far ahead of it that actually, to Michelle's point, we're at risk of being inauthentic. So I think there's definitely that tension still exists in the Sanford world. I think we're lucky enough to have a lot of internal capability, and of course I think the fact that our strategy is all about sustainable seafood, that makes our why incredibly easy. But I think, again, to Michelle's point around stakeholders, we have a very wide and diverse array of stakeholders, from our shareholders, our employees, all of the people that are really committed and passionate to New Zealand's environment and our footprint in that environment as a commercial seafood company. So there's a lot of stakeholders that we're grappling with, and so we're happy to share. We're taking some steps with an external partner now to try and make sure that we're packaging up that information in a consistent way over time, so we're not overloading the team who are operating a big complex business with constant sort of ad hoc requests around sustainability data points. So there's quite a lot going on in Sanford, and it has been an interesting journey as we move towards out of the voluntary world and into the mandatory world.
But it's interesting too, right? I mean, the fact that you've been at this for such a long time, and then you get something like these mandatory reporting standards come along. It's sort of the same thing, but do you envisage much of a shift between what's being done now and the sort of standards that Michelle's talked about?
Look, I think there still is going to be a bit of a shift. I think the sort of the more optional nature of things to date has given us a bit more freedom. I think what gives me as a a director on Sanford some comfort, because in the seafood space we tend to, we're all fishing in the same oceans. So I think, it's factual, right? Yeah, that's factual. But what's interesting with seafood, I think, is Sanford has sort of been at the forefront of leading some of our collaboration efforts within the sectors. To Michelle's point around how are these standards going to impact specific sectors, and one of the challenges being a New Zealand company is that we are small on the global stage. So what Sanford's been doing with our peers in the seafood space is collaboration efforts to define the fishery and aquaculture sector. So a lot of that work around scenarios and being defined, and agreement among our different stakeholders around what's important, is actually putting us in a good position as a sector, so that when the mandatory statements come out, standards are finally released in December. And I suppose the thing I would say, there's not a massive time gap between when the standards are actually released in December and when we all have to start reporting. That's probably one of the things as a director that makes me slightly nervous. But I think the pre-work that the commercial fishing sector has done puts us in a decent spot, because I think that gives us a little bit of a head start. But yeah, there still is going to be, the devil's in the detail on some of the stuff. There is still, no matter how we skin it, there's still going to be some challenges. But I suppose the way I'm approaching it, we are approaching it, and it's good to hear Michelle talk about this. I think in the early days, I'm hopeful that there's a little bit of a sort of a best efforts. Let's just keep building on what everybody's done to date and demonstrate progress, and this will continue to refine over time, would be my expectation and hope.
Yeah, we might come back to Michelle on that as part of the Q&A, actually, because I think that transition piece is something that we should definitely look at. But you're in a rather unique position in terms of being on the chair of Sanford's Audit and Risk and Finance Committee. And I think sometimes in these things, it's very easy with these climate-related disclosures, a bit like some of the financial reporting standards, to get all kind of donkey deep in the detail in terms of the standards themselves. Whereas your role, and I think it's probably sitting alongside, I think you've got an environment, people, and health and safety subcommittee as well, which is kind of a counterpart to the committee you chair. Both of those have a bit of a role in these climate-related disclosures, as well as wider sustainability reporting, presumably. Do you want to talk a little bit about to our participants today about how that works at Sanford, and how these climate-related disclosures are going to play through in that regard?
Yeah, look, I think that's so it's actually useful, I think, that we do have the two subcommittees at play. So people, health, environment and safety on one side, and audit, finance and risk on the other. So where it really shows up in the audit, finance and risk subcommittee, an example would be around CapEx. So what's interesting about Sanford, on the one hand, we've got this advantage that sustainability is in our DNA, and we've been thinking about this and operating transparently on this for a very long time. On the other side of the ledger, how we, our deep sea vessels, for example, are very big, capital intensive, 30, 40, 50-year-old assets. And a large part of our emissions right now are coming from exactly those big deep sea vessels. And because of the long lives of those assets and the big check sizes to invest in them, and there is no environmentally friendly alternative. You can't go out into the world and buy hydrogen, ammonia or methanol powered vessels for deep sea fishing in the Ross Sea. So how I think, coming back to CRD and sort of the sustainability more broadly, we do, as part of our CapEx decisions, test quite hard where, how we're thinking about sustainability in our physical plant and our CapEx decisions. Where we can make great decisions, like the boiler example that I alluded to, we do. But we are constantly pushing the team on how could we, we're sort of waiting for technology in some areas to catch up, but to the extent that the technology is there, or we could be part of technology arriving in New Zealand, that's a large part of how we do it. But it's a little bit of in the detail, so that's a CapEx decision, but then there's also the going wide, how are we staying mindful of the overall sustainability roadmap, because Sanford with the sustainable seafood space, we do have quite a wide sustainability lens, in addition to, and then of course there's climate related risks like rising sea temperatures and all sorts of stuff. So it's it can be quite wide. So I think what our two subcommittees do quite nicely is play wide, but also play deep. And CapEx would be an example where we get quite into the detail. And the team's also working through things for the future, such as, you know, shadow carbon pricing, how we use that in financial simulations for new assets, et cetera, et cetera. But our AFRC is increasingly demanding more accountability and substance around our climate targets. So I think historically, back in the day, they were a little loose, a little bit out there. What the AFRC nicely does is bring, you know, let's just bring some hardcore quantitative / financial mindset to it, which is a good balance with our broader people, health and safety and environment subcommittee.
Yeah, and I guess the thing in terms of what Michelle was talking about before about this sort of standardization and stuff like that, to the extent you've got investors and others across that stakeholder group wanting to see certain kinds of consistency in the reporting, that happens. I guess the other thing that occurs to me as you were talking, that across both of those subcommittees of the board, there's quite a strong focus in terms of taking a longer term view. Yeah. So if you actually do see some of that technological change happen, strategically, you're able to sort of slot that into some element of either of the subcommittee's remits to make that move forward.
Totally. And that sort of ties back to some of my time with NZ Super as well. I mean, NZ Super would say, if you are investing for the long term, then you have to take into account environmental, social and governance factors, because when you're investing with that 20, 30, 40-year time horizon, those factors start to make material impact on your investment returns. Sanford's not dissimilar in the sense that we've got these 30, 40-year vessels, plus our, you know, our quotas. Like, and we, you know, we are in New Zealand, we're a somewhat iconic New Zealand company, and we're operating in, you know, really precious New Zealand natural environments. And so, you know, we do take that very seriously, and that does push us into a long-term view around these things.
This might be a bit, just taking that into account as some of your wider experience as well, I guess. When Sanford's has been at this for a long time, and certainly, you know, as you said, from 2018, starting to make those choices around different sorts of technology in terms of process heat and so on and so forth, and therefore the reporting on all of that. This may be a difficult question to answer, Fiona, but if you were sort of advising a board or an organisation that was only just starting out on this reporting journey in particular, and presumably therefore taking some steps in relation to both adaptation and emissions reductions, what do you see the barriers and the challenges for those boards as being, sort of looking at that from that governance level rather than just an organisational level?
Yeah, well, look, I think one of the barriers is that short-term versus long-term thinking. I think particularly in the listed space, it's easy to fall into the trap of just focusing on the short term. And I think if you're going to succeed in the sustainability reporting space, you really do have to be able to step back and have a much longer term lens. And I think shareholders and NZ Super's kind of led the charge in New Zealand on this. I think shareholders are increasingly demanding that longer term lens. So I think that's probably going to be quite a big cultural shift for some of my director colleagues across the New Zealand market, who are used to thinking about everything in EPS and EBIT terms. And the reality is you've got to step back and think much longer term. It doesn't always naturally fit into a spreadsheet, but the reality is when you put a 20, 30 year spreadsheet on it, it actually all of a sudden does fit into your spreadsheet. So I think that's an important one, that long-term mindset. And I think boards working well with their execs and both having that long-term mindset is important. I mean, that starts to inform all sorts of things, right? Like remuneration, incentives, and how decision-making happens. I think the other bit is really all of us just being open to the idea that disclosure is a process. I think starting with a gap analysis and, you know, starting with qualitative, which is kind of where Sanford started. I think that's, you know, I think for companies who are trying to get to gold standard with hardcore quantitative from day one is a very ambitious goal. Some companies may get there, but I think everybody starting with that gap analysis and getting really clear on a more sort of qualitative approach to get going is, but yeah, I would be getting, per Michelle's comment, I would be getting going on it now. But stepping back, I think that long-term focus is really important. And you know, as Michelle was saying, if everybody approaches this purely as a disclosure exercise, then I think we really are missing an opportunity here. I think it's much more than disclosure. This is a great example of accounting standards being used as almost a catalyst or a bit of tension to actually get us lined up and thinking how we should be, which is longer term and broader stakeholder set.
It's interesting, Thelma. You could argue the same is true with financial statements, but yet financial statements are just as one of our facilitators actually on our company directors course says, that the financial stuff is a different form of language to describe certain activities happening in companies and so on and so forth. But it's interesting, Thelma, your point about shorter term earnings per share and the earnings before interest and tax focus. When arguably when you start valuing an organization or a company at least, you take a long term view. That's what a net present value is.
Totally.
All we're saying here is extend that, I think, in terms of these disclosures to something that's in a slightly different realm, but still has a link to value. I guess before we just turn to the questions from our audience, I'll just remind our audience that you can ask questions of our panel today using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We've got a few questions already, but I encourage you to ask us arrange more questions given the audience or the panel we have today. But I wanted to just ask you a slightly more personal question, Fiona, and that is, what's the biggest lesson for you personally as a director leading some of this work from that Audit and Risk Committee perspective, but also some of your broader day job as well?
Look, I think the biggest lesson for me personally was coming into the professional director space from a corporate role, and now I'm sort of juggling both. There were just a lot of assumptions that I brought in, to be honest. And when I started on Sanford, I was sort of in the investment banking, just out of the long-term investing world. So I think, I made a lot of assumptions about how boards operate, and in particular that bit around horizons. And so I think that's been a big lesson, but I think it's an area where I think CRD is actually going to usefully help boards step into that longer term focus. Yeah, that would be my big learning. That's a personal learning. But
that's quite insightful though. And I do think it represents some of the governance journey that many people on these boards take. And in some senses, you could also argue that some of these newer things and newer focuses are part of that curiosity and learning that we'd expect all of our directors, both in the corporate sector, but also in the not-for-profit sector, to have as well. Hey, welcome back, Michelle. I think we've got a question right off the bat coming out of my conversation with Fiona, and that is this question of transitions and the expectations of what will happen in 2023 with the first round of these climate-related disclosures lining up with the other financial reporting. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Sure. So we'll issue the standard at the end of this year, and then because my New Zealand companies are June and March balance dates, it'll be March and June 2024 that we'll see the first real full set, although interestingly a lot of companies have already started to adopt and move to them, even though they're still in sort of exposure draft stage. So we'll see that progressively happening over the next wee while. We've said right at the get-go that we didn't expect perfection on day one, recognising that it was new and that organisations and sectors are at different places. Now that doesn't mean it's still about best efforts. It's not about not being clear, not being concise, and not being honest and reporting with integrity. So we have been working closely with regulators. Primarily we have the Financial Markets Authority in New Zealand and also our central bank, and because everyone is learning in this space, and so we've been trying to work really closely with them to get I think it's really important that the regulators support that sort of approach, because it could all be undermined by a heavy-handedness from a regulator who applied the same level of expectation as it might on financial reporting in day one. And also given that this is more of a, I would say, directional type of a reporting, as opposed to, the amount of money in your bank account is, you know what it is at the end of the year. It's either that number or that number. It's not, oh, well, just X, Y, and Z. There's a lot less subjectivity, and this is right out there in terms of subjectivity. So getting regulators alongside is really, really important. So we've been working hard on that. And the other thing that we've done within the standard is we are proposing some first and also second year exemptions. So some of the things are quite difficult to do off the bat, to Fiona's point. Some will be able to, like, disclose, we're getting to a level of detail now, but things like disclosing current financial impacts of climate change. It sounds quite easy, doesn't it? But actually, it isn't that easy. I mean, if you're an airline and okay, you haven't been able to fly because of more fog days. Well, you probably already had fog days. So how many of those are going to be based upon, well, normal weather patterns versus something, so these things sound quite easy, but you have to turn your mind to how you're really going to manage it or measure it. And a few other things like scope 3 of GHG emissions. We know scope 1 and 2 seem to be quite, relatively straightforward to measure. Scope 3, where you don't directly control and there's a bunch of assumptions. Well, if you're already doing measurement in that place, it's probably relatively easy. If you've never even started, well, let's start with 1 and 2. So we're trying to phase in some aspects of the regime, Guy.
That's marvellous. I mean, and I do think, basically what that says is the best endeavours piece of that is the important piece. This is about understanding more about these dynamics and impacts and so on firms, and firms taking the opportunities around those things. It's not about getting it, quotes, right. In that sense, and that's where some of the greenwashing stuff becomes a little problematic, I suspect, in the grand scheme of this. If I can turn to Fiona, we've got a question from our participants today, one around how do you see the TNFD framework and SBTN influencing your future operating model at Sanford, particularly given you've already had that focus on sustainability for quite a long time?
Jeepers, I wish there were not as many acronyms in this space. It is such an acronym heavy space. Look, I think it's like, again, I talked about Peter Longdale, who's our head of sustainability earlier. I think we're lucky that we've got somebody who this is his living, breathing thing, and he's been with Sanford for a while. It will continue to influence how we report and invest. But I also alluded to earlier, we, as a relatively small firm, we have got to the stage where we have so many different stakeholders approaching us for sustainability information and data on, our carbon impact and our just lots and lots and lots of data. So we actually have now finally, after being entirely in-house around sustainability, we've now appointed an external partner, and they are working with us on an annual basis to basically create a sort of a standard data set that we will be able to use for different sorts of stakeholders. So that sort of gives us long arms, so to speak. So as the different regulations and disclosure obligations and stakeholder needs vary over time, we're actually going to be better positioned now with both our in-house team and our external partners. So I feel comfortable that we're in a better position now as things evolve, because it feels like things are going to keep evolving quite frequently, to be honest. If you just look at our history back to 2021, it's changed enormously. And so we've been focusing on how do we get ourselves positioned without building an army of sustainability gurus within Sanford. How do we get positioned to sort of work through this as it continues to evolve? So that would be probably my observations there.
It's an interesting point, and maybe I can just turn briefly to Michelle to just pick up a related point in that. My understanding is that the XRB also has some a statutory mandate to produce non-binding guidance in terms of sustainability as well, which is kind of part of that TNFD stuff in some senses. Do you want to talk about, it's obviously early days on that stuff. Do you want to talk about how the XRB is starting to think about that?
Sure. Look, ideally, I would have liked to have started not with climate, but with step one, saying, what is an overarching framework for reporting that is useful to stakeholders, that has the balance of the financial and non-financial? I mean, that should be the foundation of the house, but it almost feels like we're retrofitting in the foundation of the house, having got these other bits. So I am concerned that if we start to develop, so we've got TCFD, TNFD, that we start to have bunches of different standards that are all very well-meaning, don't get me wrong, but if you start to plot, you add them layer over layer over layer on organisations to report, their reporting ends up being incomprehensible. And at the end of the day, it's about trying to explain and tell your story to your stakeholders in a way that they can understand. So we have had our mandate expanded. As I said before, there is no global standard. In terms of sustainability. We have the ISSB, but they've got a lot of work to do, quite frankly, and let alone getting everybody to apply it, and what will that look like. So we've decided as a board to take a step back at the XRB, and we thought actually what we require here is a bit of a change in perspective, and what can we actually learn. And within New Zealand, our Indigenous people are so the Maori worldview. You know, First Nations views around the world are pretty consistent in terms of that connection with to the land and to the environment, and taking a long-term and intergenerational view. And many of our organisations in New Zealand, Māori entities, tribal entities and so forth, very mature, got some amazing reporting that they're doing now. They have 100-year plans. They're reporting on a whole heap of non-financial measures. So we've decided to take a step back and start there. And what can we learn from that reporting and really understand it, that might then inform our view within New Zealand of what would be appropriate for reporting more broadly of non-financial and sustainable, and hoping to share that with the world as well once we've but can I just say, we will do that at a more moderate pace than we have on climate.
You've certainly been forced into it in terms of quite a quick progression from the climate change minister's perspective as well, I suspect. But I guess we had a bit of a question from my counterpart at the AICD in Australia, just in terms of that ISSB piece. But I take it from what you've said that, you know, the ISSB's got a bit more work to do in terms of that sustainability reporting framework. And we've got some thinking to do more generally in terms of how to tailor that to New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand specific conditions, as well other jurisdictions.
That's exactly right. And I think IWSB, I actually think they've done an amazing job to turn around their exposure drafts so quickly, not only on climate, but also they've put in a general standard, which is really to bring, it's almost trying to build that foundation. The thing that I would look at it from is it does come very much from a Western view, and it comes very much from a commercial view as well. And I'm not saying that that's bad, but it's not as inclusive as it might otherwise be. And we'd be wanting to set a standard, at least here in this country, that could be equally applied by our government, by public sector organisations, for charities, you know, scalable in an appropriate way. So that's harder to do, of course.
Well, but follows the standards we've adopted around financial reporting, of course.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. Yeah. Hey, can I turn to Fiona? I want to go back to a point you made in one of your answers to my questions, and you talked about data and the availability of data at Sanford's. And it sounds to me from what you said that actually that's quite a strength for Sanford's. But presumably you've had experience with other organisations where perhaps that data isn't quite as available.
Yes.
And wondered about what recommendations you'd have, particularly to boards, in terms of asking the right questions where that data might be a bit sparser than it is at Sanford's.
So to us, yeah, just to sort of be clear on Sanford, I think we do have a lot of data. One of our big challenges, and it's why we're in the midst of a sort of a big enterprise system upgrade. We have a lot of data. It's not always accessible, and that seems to be from working in a few New Zealand organisations, or with a few New Zealand organisations. That seems to be a little bit of a common pattern across New Zealand, that we don't have our digital systems aren't as well positioned in terms of enabling data to be accessible and usable, for want of a better word. So it might be it's in a it's not machine readable, so it's all sort of buried in core systems, or it's very unstructured, and therefore you can't sort of do all the pattern reading that you would expect from more modern systems. So Sanford definitely has a lot of data. It's not necessarily accessible, and a lot of our sustainability work right now is very manual. So I wouldn't want to put us out there as the high ground in terms of accessible and beautiful data lakes, et cetera. But I think that is absolutely something that I think all companies in New Zealand should be thinking about a lot more deeply, because we may not know what all of the, we hope, per Michelle's comments, that future sustainability reporting standards are a little bit more measured. This one has probably felt quite rushed, and I think that's fine. It's getting us where we need to go. But in the board space, I think more companies across New Zealand should be thinking about how do they get their data into a state that, as our reporting obligations change and evolve over time, we're in a position to very quickly leverage that data in a machine readable and scalable ways. I think it does worry me a bit in New Zealand that there are a lot of companies where they potentially have data advantages but they can't leverage it, or they're not capturing the data at all. And in a modern, fast-moving world, that's going to put, if companies don't even have the data, let alone able to access it, I think that's going to put them further and further and further behind in the future. And then it puts them at risk around these sorts of disclosure obligations. So I think data is absolutely something all boards should be thinking about hard. And then of course you've got cyber risk and all sorts of other stuff over the top of it. But data really is it's one of the killer advantages that most companies have in terms of figuring out strategic alignment and how we're performing, et cetera, et cetera. And I just, a lot of New Zealand companies don't seem to have that one as advanced as it could be. And it will make it hard in the context of CRD, I think.
Oh, and I think that's right. You made a really important point though. When it comes to this stuff, that accessibility of the data and the systems and processes to do that in a safe way. So the secure piece of that's pretty important too. So you quite quickly, and I guess it's a thread that Michelle was picking into before, this is kind of you've got to look at this in a holistic way, and it impinges on so many things. But I guess that leads to another question we've got, which is about assurance. Now, our reading of the climate-related disclosure exposure drafts standards was that the focus would be on limited assurance. I wonder, Michelle, if you could give us a feel for the XRB's thinking about that assurance function and comparability, perhaps within organisations, but over time at least, but also between organisations, particularly in the same sector. You want to tell us a little bit about the thinking behind the assurance approach that XRB's adopted, or is maybe adopting?
Sure. Look, part of this comes from the actual legislation itself. The initial thinking, which wasn't an XRB call, but the initial thinking was to have assurance across the entire report. And then as the officials started to work through the detail, I thought, well, for financial reporting, we have licensed auditors and we have a whole regime around that. Whereas arguably, when you move into climate-related disclosures, there are different skill sets required. And so what's the regime for registering and ensuring consistency and high standards within that assurance community? And so that, I'd say there's been a bit of a pause push on that. So I think right here, Guy, we're in a bit of a, I think it's a short-term situation where under the standards, the only assurance that is required is on the GHG disclosures. So your emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3. And then it was for the XRB to determine what type of assurance. And all the work that we had done on that so far says, look, depending on your processes and controls and et cetera, you can probably get there with positive assurance, which looks like a normal audit opinion for scope 1 and scope 2. But for scope 3, it's probably going to be mostly limited and not full assurance. So that's sort of where we're landing at this point. Where I think we ultimately end up will be the whole report being assured. But I think over time, we have to see evolution of the assurance product as well.
Yeah, and that means the capability and the assurers as well, right?
Correct. So, and there is internationally work being done on assurance around sustainability reports. So that's being done at the International Standard Setting Board level. The other thing I'd say just for directors though, okay, so that's the legal requirement in terms of what you might have an assurance report on or not. That does not stop a board thinking, well, what level of assurance can we get internally? Do we have a separate risk management function who are not involved in actually preparing, who can give us a level of what's their role? What's our internal audit role? And then we may have also external assurance who will be able to look at either all or parts of it. So my question comes back to how as a director are you getting comfortable around the disclosures that are being made? And you're not, it'd be nice to get a piece of paper that says it's all great, sign here, but I don't think that's realistic in the short term, quite frankly. Yeah. That's
great. No, that's a really useful set of insights, I think. If I could just turn briefly to Fiona in the moments I have left, and just a really quick answer to possibly quite a difficult question before we finish off. You've talked about data, and the question that's being asked is also about traceability. So are you using or intending to use blockchain to trace your catch from hook to plate at Sanford?
Big question. Not right now. I think we want to walk before we can run. Not right now. But
Yeah.
absolutely being able to track our seafood, so leaving blockchain to one side, but absolutely being able to track our seafood more directly from vessel all the way through processing out to customers. That's potentially out there at some stage, but blockchain, that would be a short no for right now.
Oh, but I guess it's one of those things that goes to the heart of what you were talking about earlier, which is
Totally.
of a longer term view of this, looking at the technology palette, if you like, as it's changing, and being in a position to anticipate that stuff, even if it's not right now. And being able to sort of show through your narrative as well as the reporting what it is you're actually doing. And that's
no, absolutely
important.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, I think we're almost out of time. If I can thank Michelle and Fiona for joining us to share your expertise and your experience today. It's been really insightful, and hopefully our international audience has found it that way too. Before I close today's session with a karakia or a blessing, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. We look forward to growing this community and connecting with you again as New Zealand's journey on climate-related disclosures continues. Inoi tātou, kia whakaria te tapu, kia wātia aitiara, kia tūriki whakataha ai, homie, huie, taikie, and ka kite anō, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.